Welcome everyone to the 2024 Elizabeth and Irwin Warren Folk Art Symposium. The picture is still out there, Reframing Black Presence in the collections of early American art and material culture. Thank you for joining us across time zones today for an exciting programs and presentations and conversations. I'm Mathilde Walker-Billot. I'm curator of programming at the American Folk Art Museum. A quick note that closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. I'm joining you today from Queens, New York. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenape-Hawking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor the Lenape people, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. As many of you know, affirm is dedicated to the work of self-taught artists across time and place. Second slide, please. And we're thrilled to offer new perspectives on early American art and material culture with the exhibition Unnamed Figures, Black Presence and Absence in the Early American North, now on view at 2 Lincoln Square until March 24th, along with a concurrent exhibition, Marvels of My Own Inventiveness. Unnamed Figures, Black Presence and Absence in the Early American North share the untold stories of Black experience in New England and the Mid-Atlantic from the late 17th century to the antebellum, through a large range of media, including painted portraits and landscapes, needleworks, wax on paper, sculptures, photographs, and other vernacular forms. Curators Emily Gevold, Dr. Arwel Watson, and Shade Ayorinde actively chose to refocus their attention on Black subjects to center interpretation on those who have been omitted and erased from public history. So the 2024 Elizabeth and Irwin Warren Folk Art Symposium uses the research behind the making of this exhibition as a platform for broader consideration of issues and museum practice in relation to folk art, early American history, and issues of anti-Black racism. So the third slide, the next slide. Part of its title is the phrase, "The picture is still out there." It refers to Toni Morrison's concept of re-memory. In her novel, Beloved, the writer grapples with the aftermath of slavery. She meditates on how traumatic pasts live in the present and take on pictorial forms. One of her characters says, "Even if I die, the picture of what I did or knew or saw is still out there." The symposium gathers scholars and curators who have embraced these ideas of a surviving past by considering images, objects, and material culture as manifestations of historical events and experiences, as material witnesses that prompt us to remember. And the next slide. So featuring 2 conversations and 2 panel discussions taking place today and on Friday, March 8th, the symposium will share methods of preserving, acquiring, and exhibiting early American material culture that address histories of colonialism and racism while discussing ways to acknowledge and recognize the steady presence and creativity of African Americans in history. So today we kick off the first day of the symposium with a rich program. As you can note in the schedule, we will begin by hearing opening remarks from Emily Gevold, curatorial chair for collections and curator of folk art at AFAM, co-curator of the exhibition Unnamed Figures. Dr. Jennifer Van Horn and Dr. Gwendoline Dubois-Shaw will then be in conversation for an hour, followed by Q&A with you all. Following this first session, there will be a 30-minute break, and we will resume the program at 1:30 p.m. with our first panel, Reframing Early American Art Collections, featuring art historians and curators Elizabeth S. Free, Dr. Janine Yorimoto-Bolt, and Michael Hartman, introduced and moderated by Anne Strockman-Cross. Please do submit your question in the Q&A feature, as there will be time for questions at the end of each session, and we will make every effort to get to as many as possible. I'll be using the chat room to share more details about the program, the schedule, and the speakers. And if you need any additional information, please drop me a line in the chat. Today's program is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. And I hope you will consider supporting our programs through a donation to the museum following this symposium. Your support has great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of folk and self-taught artists. And the next slide. So now it's my pleasure to invite Émilie Gevold to make opening remarks and introduce our symposium. Émilie is curatorial chair for collections and curator of folk art at affirm. After Émilie's remark, we'll hear from Jennifer Van Horn, Associate Professor of Art History and History at the University of Delaware, and Gwendoline Dubois-Shaw, class of 1940 bicentennial term, Associate Professor of History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania. In this program, titled Potential Portraits, Reckoning with the Gaps of History, the speakers will discuss recent innovative scholarship related to the study of early Black representation and portraiture. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you so much, Mathilde, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here in the company of distinguished scholars, innovative scholars today. I'm Emily Gevold. I'm curator of folk art and curatorial chair for collections here at the Folk Art Museum, and I'm thrilled to be here to welcome you all and begin this exciting two-day convening of scholars and curators. So by way of an introduction, I wanted to offer some brief remarks reiterating the goals of the exhibition for those who may be less familiar or haven't had a chance to see it yet, while also in the spirit of gathering together. I wanted to provide some background on the truly collaborative nature of the Unnamed Figures project. This is something that's been in the making for more than 6 years now, and collaboration has been a real source of joy and inspiration throughout the endeavor, beginning with our 3-person curatorial team of me and my colleagues, Sade Ayurinde and R.L. Watson, and extending into conversations with so many different AFAM staff, and of course, the multiple private and institutional lenders who have participated in the show with us, as well as contributors to the book, some of whom are here with us today, and descendants of early African-American Northeasterners and other advisors and mentors. In particular, we stand on the shoulders of innovators in the field, including especially our first speakers today, Gwendoline Dubois-Shaw, whose pioneering exhibition Portraits of a People laid essential foundations for projects like Unnamed Figures, and also Jennifer Van Horn, whose scholarly work includes the landmark recent Portraits of Resistance, and whose teaching methodology sparked the idea for this project when I took her seminar in 2017 at the University of Delaware on the material culture of slavery. Implicitly, but also significantly, Unnamed Figures has engaged with curatorial voices in museums across the country and even globally as sources of inspiration for the project's own curatorial interventions. For instance, stepping into the 18th century American art galleries at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, the visitor is met with this unexpected prompt located adjacent to a parade of colonial portraits memorializing celebrated New England figures such as Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock. Who is missing? Asks a label beside this empty gilded picture frame. Who do you want to see? The text further queries, noting the lack of oil portraits and 18th century New Englanders of color, such as Crispus Attucks, Phyllis Wheatley, and Elizabeth Freeman. This type of curatorial gesture, this invitation to envision the unseen, is something that's becoming more and more common in early American art galleries. In 2018, for instance, another iteration of this was when the Worcester Art Museum recontextualized its colonial portraiture collection by adding new labels to its walls that highlight the sitter's practices of enslavement and other entanglements with the institution of slavery. Numerous other institutions have staged related curatorial interventions in recent years, highlighting the persistent issues of absence, invisibility, and erasure of figures of color in British American art and material and visual culture. With Unnamed Figures, we wanted to apply such ideas not only within permanent collection galleries, but across a broader scope, gathering lone objects intentionally under this same critical lens in order to expand and enrich these kinds of gallery conversations from the 18th century into the early 19th. To do this, as we state in the introduction to the exhibition, we need to look back in time and begin, of course, with the recognition that Black figures and faces seldom appear in American art of the 18th and early 19th centuries. But less apparent are the ways in which art, historical and museological practices have contributed to that sense of invisibility long past the point of these images' first creation, not only through action, but also inaction. So we can easily acknowledge that when represented, Black figures were typically placed in secondary positions, made tiny or subsidiary, subjected by both artist and patron to marginalization, and portrayed as lacking individuality. Often, as we see here in this work from AFAM's own collection, these figures go unnamed and are therefore implicitly excluded from the story of the picture. Of course, these dynamics were initiated by the work's makers and their originally intended consumers, and in particular, their patrons. However, this kind of compositional sidelining has also been reinforced by histories of interpretation, with earlier generations of museums and art historians reinscribing through narrative repetition white representations as the dominant point of interest. Incorporated into portraits of elite white sitters, enslaved and free Black servants have typically been glossed as incidental, their presence left without further exploration or interpretation. Countless unseen men, women, and children inhabited the spaces referenced by such pictures, but by art historical tradition, we usually speak first and often exclusively of those who can be seen. But as we have put it to visitors during curatorial tours of the show, we do not need to follow the script that has been set by past makers, patrons, and interpreters of art, or at least we do not need to only follow that script. Asking our visitors to engage actively and critically with what they're seeing, we acknowledge that we're perhaps asking them to do more work than they might be accustomed to, but we've been really thrilled to see the level of engagement that this has produced in the galleries. More than once, visitors have responded that the show makes them think differently about art. And in this sense, the visitors themselves become collaborators in the project. Lastly, I would like to underscore how descendants of early African-American Northeasterners have made vital collaborative contributions to the exhibition through oral history. It's been especially inspiring to speak with the Lloyd family, two members of whom are seen here, Egypt and Dennis Lloyd. They are descendants of Darby Vassall, the man memorialized in this Civil War era doll made in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that appears in the show. We also met with Joan Huggins Banbury and her cousin Bonnie Johnson, whose ancestors of the Phillips family in New Milford, Connecticut, walked the paths and stewarded the landscapes seen in this late 19th century painting by Ralph Earl in the background. And here you can see the depiction of those paths that were walked not only by the wealthy landowning family who held these properties, but also by numerous members of the community, both free and enslaved. Eleanor Meyer, whose ancestors were both enslaved by and biologically related to the Dutch New York Van Bergen family, is shown here together with her distant cousin, Deborah Bruno, also a Van Bergen descendant. And they speak very powerfully in their oral history about how meaningful this portrait of their ancestral lands has been to them, especially for Eleanor Meyer as a Black woman. Who is so rarely able to make those pictorial connections. Also inspirational are the independent projects that these contributors are pursuing, including the Lloyd Family Consortium, the Slave Legacy History Coalition, which partners with institutions and individuals to raise awareness about histories of slavery in the Boston area, and a book called A Hudson Valley Reckoning, authored by Deborah Bruno with an afterword by Eleanor Meyer. These women, rather than being silenced by the potentially disturbing connections between their family histories, have come together in a model of partnership to pursue the raising of awareness around early histories in New York together. Such projects really provide wonderful models for continued collaboration across disciplines and communities. So by creating space today with this symposium and on March 8th as well, which I hope you will join us for, we're hoping to create opportunities to bring together a variety of curatorial projects and practices through today's speakers. And we hope that these sessions will make further opportunities for fruitful collaborations and inspiration. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speakers today, Gwendolyn Du Bois-Shaw and Jennifer Van Horn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's such a pleasure to be here, and what a joy it is to talk to my colleague, Jennifer Van Horn. Jen and I were lucky enough to not only participate in this amazing project, but also to co-teach a class together this fall. So we've been spending a lot of time recently together talking about some of these issues. I think we first met each other back in 2015 or 16, maybe 2015, when we were both fellows at the National Portrait Gallery doing research in cubicles side by side. So about 10 years of conversation, and then much more recently coming together with our students also to think through things. So it's great to be here.
Yeah, and just to second how excited I am to have a chance to not only be in dialogue with Gwendolyn, who you will get to hear me fangirl about in a little bit, but also to be able to be a part of this exhibition and to really see the kind of generative work that's happening, and to get to maybe pause for a minute and to talk about kind of where we've come from, where we are, and where we're going, and to have the chance to do that together and with you all. So I'm excited.
Yeah. So when we were thinking about what we were going to talk about today, we came up with a path through time and through objects. We wanted to talk about scholarship, earlier projects that, as Emily said, this project, in some ways builds on work that I've done, that Jen has done, but our work, builds on that of other people. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that. Some special objects that we think are really generative and exceptionally powerful in regard to absence and presence. We also want to talk a little bit about issues of display and label writing, which I think are really key issues for those of us who both work inside and outside of the museum, whether we are curators writing labels or scholars being asked to write response labels, which I think are an interesting and innovative development of the last decade or so. So we want to talk a little bit about that. Issues of presence and absence, and also legends of creation and belonging that attend and attach themselves to many of the objects that are in the exhibition. We want to talk a little bit about artists who emerged from obscurity, over the last 20 or 30 years, and different modes of remaking and engaging with these objects. And then we're going to end with the exhibition experience and questions from all of you. Please, questions. That would be great. So with this first image, when I was thinking about some of the projects that really inspired me when I began working on portraits of a people, and when I began my professional career following graduate school, it was definitely this exhibition catalog, Facing History, The Black Image in American Art, 1710 to 1940 by Guy McElroy. I never met Guy McElroy. He tragically passed away in an automobile accident shortly after this exhibition was mounted in 1991. But this was a catalog that was given to me when I was a graduate student. And every page in it was a revelation to me. I didn't see the exhibition in person. It was at the Corcoran, and it also traveled, right, Jen? Where did it, I think it also traveled? But I only knew it through the catalog. My mother gave me the catalog as, I think, a graduation present. And I went through every page of it. And there's an introductory essay in there by Henry Louis Gates Jr. And I think that Skip's essay in this catalog is one which, you know, really thinks about issues of stereotypes and actual histories, and the way that when we engage with the Black image, we are not only engaging with images of individual Black people, but with the whole history of stereotypes and derisive imagery, that much of what we think of as, you know, positive representation or you know, kind of straightforward representation, that so much of it is in reaction to histories that serve to degrade and dehumanize. So I always felt like his preface in this catalog really helps to understand kind of what comes afterwards and the choices that McElroy made. And, you know, with the images that are in this exhibition catalog, McElroy chose so many different kinds of representation. There's popular prints, things like that, as well as paintings, sculpture. There are images by African descended artists and images by artists with no African descent known in their background. And so it is a much more kind of capacious view back into that history. And it's also kind of a long view, 1710 to 1940. But I always felt it was a great introduction. Jen?
Oh, yeah. I'm good.
Okay. And the image of the Black in Western art, right? So this is one of the, you know, most important archives that's like a non-archive in certain ways, and that is a book series, right? The image of the Black in Western art is at Harvard University as part of the Hutchins Institute, part of the Du Bois Institute there. And it, you know, when I started doing this research, you went to the image of the Black and it was this big long row of binders with Xeroxes of images in them. So it was like a, you know, this massive source that one could go to, but the images weren't in color always, you know, it wasn't like that, the objects were there. But just being able to go through all of those binders and understand how vast you know, representation of Black folks in Western art was you know, very inspiring. And over the last 15 years, these books, which began to be published in the 1980s, have been reissued, updated, and expanded. And I remember people giving me copies. I'm looking around my office now, copies of old ones that were in French, you know, and however you could get a copy. It was all about, you know, seeing these amazing images, which, you know, are spread throughout the world, right? The actual objects. And spread in many different locations, from archives to churches to libraries, you know, private collections. And this project initiated by the Menil Foundation, by Dominique de Menil, in the 1970s, really, I think, changed the landscape entirely for this kind of research.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just say to that, it's fascinating to hear about your early experience with this archive, right? Because coming into this just a beat later, the published volumes were just such a pivotal source. And I just think about the ways that those continue to resonate, right? That really has become the starting point for so many folks for research, which is just, you know, really enhancing the number of scholars who are doing it. Okay, are we ready for our next?
Sure, yeah. And for me, also, the Black Presence in the Era of the American Revolution. This is a revised edition, a reprint, but Sidney Kaplan and Emma Grady Kaplan's work. Of course, Sidney Kaplan, the father of Paul Kaplan, a great scholar in this area of Black representation. This project came about in connection with something that happened almost 50 years ago, which is the bicentennial, right? We're coming up on the semi-quincentennial, which is very exciting for us Americanists. And this project, the Black Presence in the Era of the American Revolution, was one of these exhibitions and book projects which really brought in to view both portraits and other representations of Black people who lived during this period, but also their contributions to the revolutionary project, in spite of not being fully included in the goals or the realities of what came next during the early Republic. I think it has provided a lot of kind of signposts and clues, names, and organizations that have acted like breadcrumbs for researchers to trace back and to look for representations of people who were prominent during this period. Thinking about, I don't know if you follow, Jen, news on AI, but AI is like, I'm fascinated by AI and by developments in representation. And, just this week, Google, which has Gemini, which is their AI project, they just pulled back on it because its image generator for generating images of historical figures has been too multicultural too multicultural for what is viewed accuracy, as being accurate by some of its users, meaning that, and then one of the examples that I saw online was a picture of, like a tiled picture of 4 images that were generated of founding fathers from the period of the Revolution who included Black people, right? So there's a sense, I think, that is still very widespread that Black folks weren't part of the founding moment in this country, or weren't part of Renaissance Europe, when in fact we've always been in all of these places, and present. And well, these AI programs still have a long way to go in terms of being more discreet in their choices, saying that they're producing erroneous imagery is a problem. And I think it connects back to these issues that we have more broadly, and that one of the things Emily was saying about people coming to the show and not realizing, how absence has denied presence, right? This is still such a big issue, and I think it's one that, if AI and if image production and the production of history moving forward is to be more expansive, truthful, capacious, etc., scholars will have to be engaged, right? I don't think we can just kind of sit back, but rather we really have to talk back and help with some of this. And that used to just happen in exhibitions like the Black Presence in the era of the American Revolution, but I think increasingly we have to be more activist in other ways.
Oh, absolutely. It makes me think too about, in some ways, how wonderful it is to have this chance in 2026, and then how prescient this work is from the bicentennial, and kind of thinking about what has happened in between, and how the needle continues to need to move.
Yeah, we could just remount this exhibition.
And it would still be quote unquote,
it would be fresh, right?
That would be actually really fun.
I'm down for it.
we need a host. We'll talk to Emily. Maybe she'll host.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to give a nod to the magnificent, amazing personage that is Nell Irvin Painter and her Sojourner Truth book, A Life, a Symbol. While this is a biography of Sojourner Truth, it is also one of the most inspiring. It includes in one of its chapters, one of the most inspiring kind of visual analyses of a group of carte de visites of a Black woman sitter ever. I learned so much as a PhD student thinking about the images of Sojourner Truth and the way that Painter really reads them and gives us a deep understanding of how Sojourner Truth was using her portraits as a way to express various values and senses of self-conception that she had, from the reading glasses that she wears here, even though she couldn't read, right? But it shows her intelligence, it shows her sense, it shows her interest in vision and seeing. The knitting on her lap that keeps her hands busy, you know, because the devil's workshop is, you know, present for those who are not engaged. The cap she wears, the shawl she wears, all of these aspects. And I learned personally so much from what Nell Painter is doing in this book. And part of that for me, I think, goes to an earlier generation, which I come out of. Now I've discovered I'm a senior scholar, which is kind of wow. Where I was never able to take a class in African American material culture or African American art, or you know, any host of subfield areas related to race and representation. But a lot of that came out of what historians were doing in the 80s and 90s, doing work like Painter was doing, thinking about visual culture, thinking about material culture. And so finding resources like this, I think, was really, really important for me to understand that in looking at images of African Americans in the 19th century, biography was really important, right? Knowing why somebody wanted to present themselves in a certain way, knowing why they included, you know, various visual cues and clues was key. And so this was a book that really did it for me.
Well, I think that brings us to Portraits of a People.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a book that just like keeps on giving. I'm so happy that it's still useful and interesting for people. One of my mentors, Pat Hills, when I was working on this project, she said, "Gwendolyn, don't do this as an exhibition. You'll never get tenure. You'll never get your promotion because it won't count, right? As an exhibition." And I was like, "Pat, I have to do this as an exhibition because the images, the objects that are in this catalog and that were in the show, so many of them came from archives, from libraries, from historical societies, places that people don't generally go to see images, to see artwork. And I really wanted to bring those things out of those spaces and talk about them together. I also wanted to focus on making a project that was a little different than Facing History. This is certainly an homage to McElroy's project, but it's tighter, it's more specific, it's 19th century, a little bit long 19th century, a little bit late 18th, but not as far back as 1710 and Justice Engelhart Kuhn. But I wanted to include images of people who were either named or known or could be. Now, as we've since discovered, the fellow on the front cover spoiled me. And if you want to know how that happened, you should buy a copy of the catalog for Unnamed Figures. But when this exhibition was up at the Addison Gallery of American Art at Phillips Andover, and I really have to thank them so much for giving me the opportunity back in 2004, 2006 to do this exhibition. Adam Weinberg was the director then, and it was wonderful that he gave me that opportunity. When we mounted that exhibition, and then when it traveled to the Delaware Art Museum and the Long Beach Art Museum, I remember when it was at Delaware, and Joyce Schiller, wonderful colleague, wonderful scholar who passed away a number of years ago and who was a big mentor for me. Joyce was able to get a grant that went along with this exhibition from oh, Emily, what's the chemical company that basically owns Delaware?
I mean, we have the DuPonts. We had AstraZeneca, maybe.
Yes, DuPont. It was DuPont. All right. So she got a grant for like $500,000 from DuPont. And because of that, over like like every single fourth grader in Wilmington and the area was able to come see the exhibition. And afterwards, I was given this mouse pad. You remember mouse pads, right? It was mouse pad. And on the mouse pad, there were tiled 9 images that kids had drawn, pictures that they had drawn of portraits that they liked in the exhibition. And they sent me the mouse pad. I opened it up and I just burst into tears. Like I just started crying. And it still makes me a little emotional because I realized at that point that if I had not done the exhibition, those kids never would have seen these faces. They never would have seen these people. They never would have made their drawings. They never would have taken that knowledge on board. And that impact, I think, is really the most satisfying aspect of this kind of work.
Now you're making me tear up, Gwendolyn.
It matters. Art history matters, Jen.
It does. It absolutely does. Do you want me to take a moment and to sketch out what I see as some of the amazing importance of portraits of people? Is that okay?
Pretty please. That would be great.
Okay, because it's not going to be as absolutely amazing as the example that you just shared, but I did just want to kind of pause and, from the art historian perspective, think a little bit about portraits of a people. And I guess, first of all, from the kind of art history perspective, just the way that this exhibition and catalog focus attention on the portrait. And, so much scholarship had talked about genre painting or stereotyped sort of larger visual culture, but, portraits of a people takes the portrait seriously, I think, as an art form. And it really kind of asks us as viewers, but also establishes people in the past as thinking about portraits being these tools for identity making, right? For Black individuals, self-fashioning, for communal identity. But I think in ways that are just so important for helping us to think about what portraits can do. I think as I look at scholarship now, my own scholarship, and then the scholarship of many folks who we'll get to hear from today and over the course of this amazing event, I see portraits of people referenced always. And I think that speaks to the role of this exhibition and catalog in creating this canon of images that really had been missing, I think, as those school groups knew, right? Missing from mainstream white American art history. And so I think in addition to that recovery, one of the things that Portraits of a People does that's so powerful is to bring these together. So it's not just one portrait somewhere, one portrait somewhere else, but you're able to think creatively and thematically and to start to kind of trace some of those connections, which just really, I think, resonates across the catalog. I also just wanted to say, and this gets like into tenuous territory in a sense, but I think the importance of the catalog and exhibition is also about tone. I think when, Portraits of a People really speaks a language of dignity, of care. And I think that has just been so important that these images themselves, but also the way that you present and interpret them, you're thinking about these fundamental questions of power, of racism, of anti-Blackness, but you're doing so, just really responsibly and respectfully. And so I think that that's just been so important for setting a kind of space in which scholars, model and participate. And I think it really just has shaped this kind of ability to look at portraits as a site of dignity. And I think that's just been such an important contribution that I see as your work continues to resonate outward.
What you say there, I think is that has always been a big concern for me. And I think that one of the things that I wanted to highlight in talking about different artists and sitters was how porous the race line was in the 19th century, because I think we tend to approach things as like black and white, and like there wasn't, like, people weren't working together. And in the art world, as in every other aspect of American history, Black folks, white folks, Native, Asian, like we were all there. We have all always been here together, in varying, in varying levels of composition. But when it came to artistic production, Black people wanted to have their images made by people who were good artists. And whether or not they were Black or white, sometimes they chose Black artists to support Black artists, and sometimes they chose white artists to support them, and because they thought they were good artists, right? So I think that desire that anybody has to have a good representation made of themselves is universal. I don't think it changes. And so I wanted to focus on artists like William Matthew Pryor, for example, who was very much a part, even though he was white, right? He was very much a part of a mixed race community and supported Black people's, his Black neighbors' interests in having them, having portraits of themselves, of their children, et cetera, and did a large number of those. And, partly that was because he was a Millerite, right? And he had religious, he adhered to religious teachings on equality and anti-racism, but he was also a smart businessman. And, one color he really appreciated was green, right? If the money was green, he would take it. I don't think he had a problem with that. And so thinking about those commonalities and the ways that people come together across these divisions was something that I wanted to focus on, rather than perpetuating or leaning into narratives that were solely about exclusion. I wanted to show how hard people had worked to dissolve those barriers, and how art was always a part of that, right? Whether it was Black artists or white artists, or artistic marriages like that of Edward Mitchell Bannister and Christiana Carto, where she was Native descended, African descended person. So there have always been these combinations, and so I was I'm very happy that that comes off as something that's good.
You meant that. That makes me think too about, I think Portraits of a People also is so important in establishing a really kind of critical framework around Black artists, and particularly with Moses Williams, but because I think about Moses Williams too, so that's the part that's been most meaningful for me, but also, with Scipio Moorhead and Phyllis Wheatley, even as artist author in a sense of that image of her. But just I think Portraits of People also, really take seriously questions around, how does artistic production intersect with Blackness? How are people, able to create these careers and have, productive productive relationships where, they are producing these amazing creative things, but then at the same time being really careful to think through some of the limitations and some of the biases that very, painfully and tragically in some cases circumscribed situations of artistic production. And so so I guess that's just to say that while we've kind of highlighted the portrait, I think you also make an incredible contribution in the part of thinking through artists and how artists are also navigating those tensions.
Yeah. And I love that people have been re-engaging with some of those artists like Wheatley, like Williams, and how we're just learning more and more about those artists, those images. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They continue to generate such great discussion. Do we want to think a
go
little
ahead.
bit? Yeah, go to Unnamed Figures, because I think we'll get to talk more about portraits of people in relation to some of the images too, right? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, this show is great. People should go see it now.
Yeah. But this catalog, right? I mean, the exhibition is amazing, but the essays in the catalog are so diverse and really bring into view so many different aspects that are hinted at in the exhibition. And whether it's related to certain essays related to certain to particular images or to particular lives and careers or modes of making. I think that this is just a triumph as a book.
No, absolutely. And I think it also captures kind of this new moment of with scholarship within the last 10 years of folks really, I think, as you're saying, thinking expansively around various types of media and connections between media. I'm thinking of Jill von Rothschild's amazing essay in here, which makes us think about Joshua Johnson in relation to blacksmithing, right? And so these ideas of revisiting figures who might seem familiar, but doing so with new questions and with new perspectives and voices, I think it really does an amazing job. Yeah.
Agreed.
So, yeah, I think we'll get to talk more about absence. I mean, I have been thinking too about the contrast with portraits of a people very much being about named individuals and unnamed figures, kind of in some sense, almost an inverse of thinking about instances, deliberately thinking about instances where naming, didn't happen or misremembering happened or, absence was created. But I think we'll get to talk about that as we. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You can always go backwards too.
That's true.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring in Nathaniel Jocelyn's Cinque, which we see here in this print reproduction, to think about some special objects and their relationships to their homes, if you will. When we think about objects in collections or on the market or in museums, sometimes it feels like objects, works of art, are much more mobile than many of them, actually are. And the Nathaniel Jocelyn portrait of Cinque was one that, even though I think it's reproduced in Portraits of People, I don't remember, I think it is, but I wasn't actually able to get it on loan because it is in, well, this print is at the Yale University Art Gallery. The portrait is in the collection of the New Haven Colonial Historical Society. I think they've changed their name recently, but they would not lend it. And this was, an interesting thing for me. I remember going down there to have a long conversation with the curator and say, this is a really amazing opportunity to share this object. And everybody knows at that time, 20 years ago, everybody knows Cinque because of Amistad, the film that Steven Spielberg, made.
Yeah.
And so it would be wonderful for people to see this portrait that was made actually when he was in New Haven, where the, where the trial was held, et cetera. And I was told, no, we don't lend this because this is what we have, right? And it is so tightly tied to our identity as a historical society that having it absent for 9 months or what have you would be a serious challenge for us in our scholarly, in our draw for scholars, but also in the programs that we do for our community. And while I was sad about that, I also recognized how important that object was to that community and how essential it was to their efforts to interpret and reinterpret the past. So I was like, okay, that's fine. Even though I had to drive home in a snowstorm and it was awful, New England snow, so a nor'easter. It was terrible. It was terrible. Can you do the next slide? Which connects. And then in that regard, this image of Flora, which Flora was in Portraits of a People. She was also in Facing History. She has been very busy. She was in the marvelous Blackout exhibition that Asma Naeem did at the National Portrait Gallery. And because of her circulation, she was at that time in the collection of the Stratford, Connecticut Historical Society, having been found with papers relating to the sale of Flora, the woman who is posed here, Flora Benjamin. The Stratford Historical Society eventually decided that it was that they should make her more available to the nation. I don't really know how to characterize it, but they decided to sell the portrait and the attendant documents to the National Portrait Gallery and the National Museum of African American History and Culture, so that this image, which depicts an enslaved woman who was probably represented by one of her owners as she passed from one family's possession into the next. I had very bittersweet kind of feeling about Flora being sold again, right? That she was still fungible in that way and could still pass from one set of hands to another. However, as a former employee of the National Portrait Gallery, like great, I was also really happy that she was going to come into the care of the Smithsonian and be accessible to scholars and to audiences. But the nature of that, right, that there was a historical society, very small historical society, which felt that they couldn't care for her, but that they had the opportunity to profit from her through that sale, gave me a little bit of pause. But that is the reality, right? Smaller institutions have challenges when it comes to fundraising, when it comes to caring for their objects. So you can't poo-poo too much.
Yeah, and I think as you're saying too, just the tremendous symbolic power of having this image in a national collection, right? And the ways that it then speaks to an audience from all parts of the United States and really from the world, right? I think it's also I think maybe we'll talk a little bit about this later too, but I think it's also hard when images of specific individuals from communities get removed from those communities. And I think that's what we're seeing here too, that I think the Unnamed Figures exhibition makes this wonderful case for reminding us that slavery happened in New England, right? And so in some ways it's hard to then remove one of the few images we have of an enslaved person who is named and known as an individual from Connecticut, right, to DC is also a hard relocation at a time when I think we're arguing so strenuously for remembering Black presence in New England.
Yeah, that's so true.
I
That's
guess
so
I
true.
share your ambivalence, but then at the same time, this is so much an object I think that deserves to be in the NMOC and NPG collections
Mhm.
that also feels like a homecoming in some ways.
Yeah, definitely.
This is one of those images. I feel like when you put it up, it takes space. It occupies the
Oh,
room.
it's so poignant. It is so poignant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should I move? Oh, yeah, similar questions maybe around Balazar.
Yeah. Do you want to start us?
Oh, sure. So one of the joys of co-teaching a seminar with Gwendolyn this past semester was that we had a chance to go with our students to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Met had just acquired this amazing painting. And so we got to see it before it kind of even went out on view, and it was just an amazing experience, I think, for both us and the students to kind of be very close to this image, which has generated a lot of wonderful discussion and conversation around absences and deliberate, omissions. So if anybody hasn't kind of watched the New York Times video about this amazing history of this painting, I would absolutely recommend that you do. But Jeremy Simeon, a dealer and a collector and art historian working in New Orleans, is responsible for not only conserving this painting to reveal the African-American figure at the top right. So just, I guess we can do the post and pre-conservation images. So at some point in this painting's history, the Black figure, who thanks to Simeon's research we now know is Belizaire, had been covered up by paint, the assumption being that that probably happened by a member of the white family, among whom this painting descended. And so in an effort to perhaps conceal a part of that family's history that they found to be difficult or problematic, that figure was covered up. And so Simeon purchased the work. He restored, with the help of wonderful conservators, restored that figure, and then worked very hard to recover Belizaire's name and history of enslavement and history post-emancipation, which we now know that he lived through the Civil War. So this is, I think, an incredible example of the ways that long histories of paintings can reveal power relationships at play and active acts of hiding some stories and privileging other stories, and just the work that really is needed to begin to bring some of these stories back into focus and into view. Do you want to talk a little bit about Mia's response label? Does that?
Yeah. So when Jen and I went up to the Met and the students and with the students went to the conservation lab and with Sylvia Yunt, the curator, the head of the American wing at the Met, talked a great deal about some of the strategies that the Met has been using to reinterpret and also expand the interpretation possibilities of objects. They had not yet put this out, and so we hadn't seen the label array, which you can see at the bottom there. 3 different labels, including this one by Mia Banyeris from Tulane University, which really talks about how important understanding portraits are for art history, for American history, and for regional history. And this is the kind of label, Mia's label, that you so rarely see because in a museum, because it is really pitched at us, at me and Jen, and and others. It is not pitched towards 99% of the people who are going to ever look at this on display. But it's so important, I think, that museums try to approach didactics and interpretive labels at multiple levels for multiple constituencies. And this is something that, I don't think one can overemphasize when it comes to issues of race and of artworks that have had complicated histories like this, where people have actually been removed from them, been over painted, or their names have been removed from the titles, from the understandings of them, that we need to be addressing each other as well as general audiences. And then general audiences may often, or may also be engaged by this kind of label, and then want to ask more questions and want more from institutions. And so I have to give a lot of respect, big props to Sylvia and company for their willingness to have multiple interpretive labels.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love that this has sort of the basic information, the conservation history, which is so pivotal to understanding the history of this painting, and then Mia's response, which I think invites you to think bigger, right? To think around these larger questions about attempted erasure or undertelling or attempted erasure of histories. I also think we wanted to just mention briefly how important Mia's work and her students' work has been in helping us to think about conservation and restoration as being really important parts of thinking through the stories of paintings that feature Black subjects, and really kind of critically interrogating institutional histories around choices of preservation and restoration, and being really clear-sighted in terms of recognizing the ways that political agendas in the past led to some acts of intended restoration that in fact resulted in defacement. And so I think part of that move towards transparency of institutions and acknowledging, past conservation or past restoration that in fact has contributed to a lack of information or an erasure of information. So I look forward to seeing more of that kind of scholarship, right? That takes that long life history into account.
Yeah, agreed. The work that Mia and her student Lucia Moma did around the portrait of Betsy, not Betsy, and the way that Betsy's necklace had been removed by conservators, and and a kind of a challenging response on the part of the historical New Orleans collection, and I think that institutions, NOMA, for example, the New Orleans Museum of Art, which at one point owned this portrait of Belisaire, has taken a lot of heat for deaccessioning it. And as they should. That was a mistake, but it's also important to know that museums make these mistakes all the time. In trying to research Black artists, I found over and over again wonderful, well-meaning institutions that have deaccessioned pieces by artists or, representations of people you're looking for. And that's just a fact of life, that these, objects move around. But in this moment, I think it really is important to focus attention on technical art history and on conservation and on the choices that curators and conservators and conservators are able to make when objects are being examined, and when resources are available to tidy them up.
Yeah, and that just makes me think too about the tremendous labor of love, I think, on the part of Jeremy Simeon to recover this history, to restore this painting, and just the ways that sometimes that doesn't in fact yield a Belisaire, right? Like sometimes that work happens and it doesn't maybe fill an absence that you were hoping that it would. Yeah. And that's, I think, unfortunately, the nature of legacies of not privileging information about African-American subjects, but just the importance of continually kind of undertaking that work, right? And
Yeah.
celebrating when it does yield a Belisare, right? Like that is kind of the thing that we're all hoping for.
Yeah, that reminds me, when I was doing research for Portraits of a People, I was in Bermuda, and I was at the Tucker House, which is amazing house in St. George's. And up on the wall, there were these portraits of these people. I'm like, oh my gosh, those are mixed race, people on the walls. And so I got a grant. I was a professor at Harvard at the time, and I got a grant to go back to look at the portraits. And I worked with the director of the National Gallery there, and they took the portraits off the wall and they took them down so that I could examine them. And I got out the lights, and I'm like, these aren't Black people. These are just dirty paintings. Like, these portraits were so dirty.
Oh.
And I really wanted them to be these mixed race colonial Bermudians, but they weren't. They were just dirty paintings that needed conservation. But it's important to look. You might not always find.
Oh no, Gwendolyn, I'm just picturing that moment.
Hey, it got me 2 trips to Bermuda. I really have nothing to complain about.
Oh no.
You can go to the next slide.
No, I'm just it's just such a funny moment. Like, oh, never mind.
Yeah, our friend Moses.
Yeah.
Yeah, this portrait, I remember the first time I saw this portrait, I think it might have been in David Brigham's book on public culture in the early Republic and the Peel Museum. And his, in his discussion of the silhouettes that were made in the museum was hugely generative for me. So, thank you so much, David, for that dissertation project that was done here at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm just got to add that in. Back when we had American Studies, we need to bring back American Studies at Penn. I would love that. But this is an image which I remember going to see at the Library Company, which is part of a larger collection of portraits of cut profiles that were collected by James Rush, who was a medical doctor and the son of Benjamin Rush, who was a prominent doctor and scientist and patriot during the Revolutionary period. And this is probably the most significant piece in that collection. And I remember when it came out, it was matted and it had just begun to receive attention. And I was really fascinated by the choices that had been made in representing this figure. And David's work was really inspirational. And so was Ellen Fernandez-Sacco's work, her dissertation, which was written at University of California, Los Angeles. In thinking about Moses Williams as an employee of the Peel Museum, but also an enslaved member of that household for most of his young life up until he was 27. And today it feels kind of funny to have this image be, really well known and kind of ubiquitous. At the Philadelphia Museum of Art in the gift shop, they have a lapel pin that you can buy. They had a tote bag for a while and some postcards. And I thought, oh my God, Moses has been merchandised. And that was a little bit of a shocker for me when that started happening a few years ago. Especially because, and this is one of the things that I think is so important about what Emily and Co have done at American Folk Art Museum with Unnamed Figures, is thinking about descendants. Because Moses's family, his children, people have been trying to trace them for a long time. I was speaking last week with folks at the Peel down in Baltimore, and they've been trying to track his descendants. But if Moses is being merchandised right now, like, who's getting this money, right? Is this money, going to support the PMA? That's great. Is it going to support Library Company? Wonderful. But there are these lines of descent, right? And when you have Black artists in the 19th century, sure, copyright has run out. But how can we think more about this material from this period, these artist legacies, and how can they contribute to communities that, that are a part of those legacies? I mean, this is just something I've been thinking about with him, because he really is, for me, like a person. Because, when you spend time with subjects, you get kind of attached to them.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. This Yes, and it's funny how, I guess I would also say as a scholar, it's funny how much I associate you with Moses Williams, and that move of like, in my head, it's like, of course you must, feel that affiliation with Moses Williams, because your work has been so instrumental in kind of moving him to the center of discourse about Peel, right, which had been so much about the white Peel family, with Moses Williams not mentioned, right, and so actually talking about Moses Williams as an artist in his own right, shifts that entire dialogue, I think, in ways that really show the kind of narrowness of some of the questions that have been asked before. This makes me think a little bit too about David Drake, right, and the kind of refinding, reclaiming of African-American craftspeople and artists, and museums' desire to make their collections more inclusive, and as a part of that, then the hike in auction prices for these works of these artists who, not only in the time period, I mean, I think we're more familiar with that, of like an artist in the time period maybe not being recognized, but these are folks who not only were not recognized, but were literally unfree, right? And so thinking about, who is profiting now from the sale of their works, thinking about descendant communities and the ways in which those profits could actually radiate outward to original makers' descendants, as opposed to kind of being kept in the zone of elite collectors.
Yeah,
it's
well,
hard.
and when I started writing about this silhouette, the first essay that I published was in the American Philosophical, right, in the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society. And that came out of having been asked to give a talk there, which was amazing. But I had also tried to publish this essay and was unable to. It languished for a year at one with one publication. Took forever for the reader to get it back, and then the reader was like, there's no way, because my argument was that maybe this was a self-portrait. It was attributed to Raphael Peel, and I said, well, people could cut their own silhouettes. Why couldn't he have cut his own if he was the person who mainly cut silhouettes? Why not make a self-portrait? And that was a radical assertion of Black agency that the reader of that essay was not buying in that moment. The American Philosophical, as has been their legacy, was much more open. They just publish whatever you say, right? To contribute to knowledge, so it's been interesting to think about both that moment of gatekeeping, like how to get this kind of scholarship published, was a real challenge for me at first, and so to bring a work like this into greater visibility, greater recognition, but also have other scholars take it up, has been important. The impact on the market in this moment for silhouettes, I think, is really stunning. I've been in conversation lately with a gallery in New York that was trying to sell some Peel silhouettes, and they said to me, how can we prove that this is these are by Moses Williams? Because if we can get more money for them as being silhouettes by an artist of African descent. Museums want to put Black ancestors on their walls, and they want to put images that were made by Black people. And I am 150% for that. Like, I have no problem with that. But I don't know how you can prove who cut Peel silhouettes for sure. So I always send them to my good friends Anne Verplank and Penley Knight, who I think have much more expertise on on those questions of Peel silhouette attribution or disattribution, because there's so many fakes out there. All you have to do is go on eBay, and if you can buy it for $150, it's probably not real, right? But this is a form of representation, a mode of making that is just now really being seen as marketable by galleries as a niche to get into that museum collecting market for ancestors and things that were made by Black ancestors. It's a funny moment.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting to hear you think about mapping on a kind of like provenance and attribution, right, onto scholarly arguments that oftentimes are also fighting, I think, against a scholarly apparatus of burdens of evidence of proof that are based on very complete archival kinds of sets of records. And when we're thinking about African-American art histories, we don't have the luxury of thinking about those complete lines of evidence, I think, in the same way.
Yeah, not all the time, that's for sure.
Yeah.
This, I was thinking about where I first saw Moses Williams, and I think that was in Bearden and Henderson, in Romeo Bearden and Harry Henderson's African-American art survey text, which is enormous, and what a huge, amazing achievement that was. And so much of their scholarship in that built on James Porter's, right? And James Porter's scholarship around artists from the colonial and the revolutionary period in the early 19th century, Neptune Thurston, right? He was the one who found all of these notices of Black makers in the 18th and 19th century, and started publishing all of that information. But it was so niche, right? Porter was so niche within the history of American art that very few of us of my generation, of yours, were taught through that work, right? Maybe we came to that work on our own, but it was so rarely part of the foundational historiographic approach that I think we were given.
Which I think, makes your scholarship so important. It makes Emily's exhibition so important. I think it just highlights the need for this kind of both moving forward with public exhibitions and moving forward with scholarship, and having that carefully documented and able to have the space to really present these kind of critical arguments. I think it just speaks to the need for those both to happen. Yeah.
Maybe the next one. What do we have? Joshua Johnston. Yeah.
Yeah.
Abner Coker. Another friend. My friend Abner with the unibrow. See, that's how you know this is a real portrait, right? The Joshua Johnston has included the unibrow. This portrait and portrait that is believed to be of Daniel Coker, Abner Coker's brother, right? Both of these are kind of attributed portraits. That pendant it has not been traveling very much. It lives in England, in Bath, right? I think it's in Bath. It has stopped traveling. It was in Portraits of a People. And I think that, since some of these objects are so rare and delicate, institutions have to put the brakes on in order to protect them for future audiences. But it's wonderful to see this portrait in the exhibition, because I think it, in Joshua Johnson, in his body of work, there are far more white sitters than Black sitters. And so this gives us the twofer, right, of an artist who was of African descent, painting African descended people, who then, right, the history of these brothers is they leave the US, they leave Baltimore and go to Liberia, and the colonial and the African colonization society, they go there. But this image, I think, is such an important one, and to think about the separation of the two, that this is up at Bowdoin, and that the pendant brother is across the pond, right? And the ways that things circulate.
Absolutely. This also makes me think a little bit about some of the questions we were discussing in relation to Moses Williams about institutions' desire to make sure that they have more images of African Americans from the 18th and 19th century in particular up on gallery walls, and trying to kind of counteract what had been a very white-centric collecting history. And I think one of the things we had talked a little bit about and teased out with the students in our seminar was what happens when there are Black artists, as Joshua Johnson was, who is oftentimes painting white subjects who were the paying patrons for those works. And like you were saying, this one is an alignment, right? It's a Black subject and a Black artist, and yet so often with Johnson, it is a white face that is painted and represented. And so I think that has also been a really interesting tension of, I think we talked about this a little bit with Virginia Anderson from the Baltimore Museum of Art during our class, that, they as an institution have really prioritized being sure that previously underrepresented artists, so, artists of color, artists who identify as female, artists who were self-trained, Indigenous artists, right, that those groups were more represented in their exhibition spaces. But unless someone knew the background of those artists, that was not visible on the walls, right? And so kind of thinking about the ways that, I don't know, I think we maybe need to kind of, as a public, be more willing to sort of, engage more with labels in the sense of finding out more about artists and putting that, into our thinking, not just kind of what is the racial identity I assume as I look at a painting from the past, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. And I think with labels, that when I started working in museums in the early 90s, we used to joke about it, like, well, what do you do when you want to call out that that the artist is Black? Do you put a black dot on the label? Like, do you color code the labels? And often we're like, oh, that just seems so ridiculous, but like, it's kind of important sometimes. And, and in many communities, it's really, really important to draw people's attention and to find ways so that audiences can locate things that are interesting, that speak to their interests. If they're bringing their children or a class and they want to talk about certain kinds of makers, to be able to easily find those, I think is really important for educational purposes. And whether it's a rack card that that lists objects and their locations in the collection, or some kind of an icon call out, or that little black stick-em dot. I certainly think all of those are really great ways to increase discussion, increase dialogue and awareness of the diversity in collections. And I actually think that even if you're not sure, like putting it up there and saying this might have been, I think that's okay too.
Yeah. I thought, oh yeah, this makes me think about, sorry, one of the things that we also really enjoyed with our class was noting the way that the label copy, so the text next to paintings and works of art in Unnamed Figures, bolds the names of the enslaved individuals who are associated with or African-American individuals in the cases where they're free. And the way that that visual cue just had helped to reorient, even though the visual evidence of a painting might be trying to assert white power, that those bolded names really helped you to realign your expectations around who was important and who should be discussed in relation to a work of art. So that just struck me as another similar kind of visual strategy of making sure that a fuller history, a more complete history is you have a way in, right? That it's more graspable.
Yeah. Do you want to jump down a couple
Yeah.
to the Hazalius and the
Oh
coon?
yeah.
And then maybe we go back to those.
Sure.
Yeah. So can you talk about the work that you and Virginia Anderson did around this?
Absolutely. So Virginia and I were lucky enough to have a co-authored essay in the catalog, which I was thrilled to write with her because she was the person really at the Baltimore Museum of Art who, as the head curator, was responsible for this renaming project. And we had a chance to kind of think a little bit about the process. I want to give you I'm looking at my notes, not because I don't remember that process, but because I don't remember when it was. It was 2021. There we go. It seems so long ago and not long ago at all. But yes, back in 2021, Virginia had a number of conversations with scholars, including myself, I think including Gwendolyn, including members of the education staff at BMA, larger community members, thinking about the title of this work. And this is a painting that has been in the BMA's collection since 1941, so a really long time. Despite the length of time it's been in the collection, it has always been known by the name of one of the two individuals who is pictured. And so it had been known as Charles Calvert, just the name of the young white boy who is pictured standing. And so we thought it was an invitation really to think about disremembering the ways that titles of artworks that do not acknowledge the presence of Black figures in those works not only de-emphasizes those histories, but performs this act of not kind of recognizing the humanity of Black figures who are depicted. So we wanted to think about retitling as a way of really kind of ethically helping to return some of the recognition of that individual's humanity. We also wanted to be really careful as we thought about renaming because, we do not know the name of this individual. Given the specificity of the portrayal of this person's face, I think it's very likely that this is a known person, but the name of that individual is not recorded. We think that this is probably someone who was enslaved by the Calvert family, seeing the fact that that individual is pictured along with the young Charles Calvert. But beyond that, we have not yet, researchers at the BMA and myself and others have not been able to determine a specific name for that individual. So in the absence of that name, we wanted to think through what can you do? How can we change the title to reflect that we don't know that name, that information is absent, that hopefully someday we will know it, that potentially, community partners, knowledge keepers, others, further research, right? At some point that name might be claimed again. At which point, hopefully the title will change, right, in order to honor that individual's newly recovered name. But so we have thought through then in our essay kind of the process of marking absence, of being really explicit in the title about information that has been lost, the information that was never kind of privileged in relation to this painting, and thinking about ways to present that to a museum visitor.
But one of the things that I loved about your essay was how you brought into the discussion the concern that had been there for many, many years by members of the community in engaging this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most fascinating aspects of this painting was discovering this, not known to me or to the BMA really, but this history of Black activism surrounding this work, of African-American staff members at the BMA, visitors to the BMA, folks really calling out previous titles, asking for better titles, asking for titles that recognized the existence of this Black figure. So we you know, in the institutional files at the BMA, right, there was this narrative that had not been acknowledged really about a long and consistent claiming of this figure by African-American community members that I think the museum responded to in various retitling moments, but was very much a Black-centered story. So that, yes, absolutely agreed. I think this was also wonderful for us to think about in relation to the amazing work on the left, which had been one of the artworks included in Fred Wilson's Minding the Museum from 1992, which, you know, very famous exhibition also in Baltimore. So it was really interesting to put this painting on the right, which, you know, art historians have thought about in relation to the Kun because of the very similar compositions and moments that they were painted. And actually the white family members, you know, those are very closely related families. But it was really interesting to think about Fred Wilson's disruption of the painting on the left in Minding the Museum, and how the impact of Minding the Museum for Baltimoreans might have then impacted the kind of questions that were being asked about the title of the Hesselius painting on the right. So
Yeah, the Justice Englehart Kuhn, Henry Darnell III image, when Wilson installed it in Minding the Museum, there was that that audio element that he added, you know, am I your friend? Am I your pet? You know, to ask these questions. And I when I was doing my dissertation research, and I went to the Maryland Historical Center to see this and to see other works by Joshua Johnson. I was stunned that at that time in 1998, maybe, there was a little mini gallery just off of the entrance that they had made, where they did a almost like a doll's house, like a little excerpt from Minding the Museum, because even though Minding the Museum used the Maryland Historical Collection, it was mounted at the Contemporary space. But it had been so generative, having made its debut as an exhibition at the same moment that the American Association of Museums, or the American Alliance of Museums, as I guess it's called now, was meeting in Baltimore, that a whole generation of curators, a whole, you know, so many people saw that exhibition because they were at that conference, and otherwise they might not have, because it was in Baltimore and not New York City or Chicago or something like that. And how generative that exhibition was, that the historical didn't want to let go. They wanted to include it, and so it was interesting to see it in, you know, in that context. But to think about the ways that communities have engaged these works, and, you know, and what has been saved and what has been displayed and how it has been displayed and how it has been discussed. I think that, you know, those institutional histories, those community histories are so important for historians of American art, like the history of the objects, as well as, you know, thinking about who these artists were, who these sitters were, but what do these pieces mean for communities? You know, Jen, do you want to go to questions? Because I saw we have a bunch of questions. We've got about 25 minutes left.
So should we stop sharing? Does that make sense? Or do we want our slides as backup?
Oh, let's just leave them as backup, but maybe Mathilde could give us questions, or Emily.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for this incredibly rich and moving and delightful interaction to watch the two of you discuss this historiography together. And I was especially struck, Gwendolyn, by your comment about the Kaplan exhibition, Black Presence, in the, oh, now I'm going to get the title wrong, but the
era of the American Revolution.
the era of the American Revolution, and how fresh that would feel even today. And I think, you know, for me working on this project, I have also really felt that, like, gosh, what, like, in some ways, like, here we are again. And I think there's something really powerful and exciting about the idea of bringing ideas back to life for new generations, and that it's kind of an inevitable part of the human condition, perhaps, that we need to remind ourselves, you know, generations forget and we need to regenerate. But I wonder whether you can comment on, you know, if you think that there is some, you know, a particular reason that this kind of forgetting of, especially, you know, just thinking about my own research interests in the forgetting of slavery in early New England, but more broadly than that too, you know, why is it that we keep forgetting, and that there is this continual need to reassert Black presence in early American history? And, you know, are there missing pieces to these projects that have happened over the years that you think will ever kind of put some of these issues to rest, or do you think it's something that we need to engage with cyclically as part of the practice?
Yeah, those cycles, huh? It really is kind of stunning how often we find ourselves back at the start again, right? Back at the beginning again. I was just reading about the Harlem Renaissance exhibition that opened just this past week at the Met. And this is really the first time the Met has done, you know, a proper Harlem Renaissance exhibition, because we aren't going to count Harlem on my mind as a proper one. But so it's been like 50 years, right? 50 years. It's a long time. But there have been other Harlem Renaissance exhibitions, but in New York City, you know, maybe it had been 20 years or something since the last one. And so people are constantly having to, you know, relearn this history. People are being exposed to, you know, to artists from the beginning of the 20th century, you know, let alone objects from the 19th and the 18th century. And, you know, for me, thinking about how we get into these cycles and how to break them so that the presence is continuous, as opposed to you know, moving in and out, I think it's going to be a real challenge, especially because we're in this moment when Black representation in contemporary art is so ascendant on the market and in exhibition, on exhibition calendars. For example, in London, at the National Portrait Gallery in London, they just opened a Black portraiture show, which is going to come to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But it's a pretty, like, you know, general kind of Black, contemporary Black portraiture. I mean, that's a huge swath of representation, but it's contemporary. And I feel like these days, in this, you know, in this moment, Black history is in competition with the Black present in a way that's just not fair, right? That museums, that curators have to make a decision when they're going to do, you know, the Black show, if the Black show is going to be contemporary or it's going to be historical. And contemporary is always going to be kind of sexier and more attractive to more larger, expanding, younger audiences than, you know, history will be. So I can't really be very optimistic. And in some ways, you know, I feel like contemporary African-American artistic production, I would hate for it to disappear in order for the Black past to get that space. I would like to see a curatorial landscape in which the diversity of American artistic production was always present, right? Whether it's historical diversity, representation, makers, you know, however. And and a little less trendy and a little less concerned also with the numbers. We won't get big audiences if we do this show. And if museums, unfortunately, weren't so dependent on that, if for example, we had a Ministry of Culture, right, that funded all the museums in the country, then maybe we would be in a different situation. But that's my kind of broad view of it, is that we are in a moment when the contemporary is ascendant, and we are likely, as long as that's the climate, we're likely to stay in this cycle. Do you feel otherwise, Jen?
No, I don't, sadly, but I'm just appreciating the way that you've framed it, because I do think that the other gesture that we keep seeing, which I think has yielded wonderful results in certain cases, is using contemporary work by African American artists in particular to call attention to historic works of art, right? So to be in the gallery of historic art and to disrupt the narratives of anti-Blackness and unfreedom through the work of an artist who is critiquing that in their own practice. So I think even there too, it's an interesting moment where it's almost like there has to be this balance, right? It's almost like they have to be seen together, or else the historic art couldn't be by itself, in a sense. I mean, I think, right, like, sadly, what has to happen is that the center has to change. The narrative at the center has to change. And until that happens, there's always going to be a rediscovery on the edges and a rebringing to the center. And so I do think that fundamentally African American art has to be recognized as the piece of American art that it is, right?
Yeah.
And American art needs to not be white American art. And so, I mean, my hope is that exhibitions like Unnamed Figures are going to encourage museums to make that move of recognizing, that historic art is also always art that is about race and power, and to pretend otherwise is a disservice.
Yeah, and I'll just say, Emily, that my colleague Susan Stein and I, Susan is the curator from Monticello. She's semi-retired now, but she and I have been shopping for the last 3 years an exhibition for 2026 on the era of the Revolution and the early Republic, and images of freedom and enslavement from that period. And, despite our best efforts, we haven't found a home for it because it is focused on the past, and because it is not spiced up by a lot of contemporary art. And that's a question. I don't want to budge on that, because I feel like there's so much historical material that really needs to be seen, and so much to be said about it. And when we get to the moment of America 250 and the semi-quincentennial, I hope that people do want to think about the past as well as the present. So fingers crossed, if anybody's out there and they're looking for an amazing exhibition.
That sounds great.
Yeah, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. And we have some questions from the audience. We have a very specific question from one object from in Unnamed Figures, one of iconic object from the Folk Art Museum collection, a view of Mr. Shura Winster's house. I think maybe Emily, you can answer to this question, but it's how if this is, apparently there's a lot of question about if this the black figure in the painting was added or discovered recently. There's a lot of question in the audience. It's from one of our ushers.
Yes, this is also maybe interesting for Jen and Gwendolyn to chime in too, because I see this as a broader trend. I've gotten, so Melissa is referring to one of the images I shared in my opening remarks, the Rufus Hathaway depiction of the harbor in Duxbury, Massachusetts, which features the red house of a white householder, maritime merchant, and probably former slaveholder. I don't have any reason. This is a work that's in AFAM's collection, and so it's been interesting to see, you know, this work interpreted in our galleries in a different way than it has been before, focusing on the Black figure who's you know, literally at the margins of the picture. I don't have any reason to believe that this was added to the painting. But it's interesting to know that you're getting this question repeatedly, Melissa, because I've also had that question come up with respect to other works, like the Potter overmantle and the Shrimpton picture, where folks are wondering, was this inserted later? And you know, as we've talked about, we see this with some, I mean, I can think of several examples where there's a Black figure that is erased from the composition later. But the idea of inserting a Black figure, perhaps, you know, if we want to think about the cover of Portraits of a People, that's a different story. But inserting a marginalized Black figure is not something that I can think of any examples of. Jen or Gwendolyn, I don't know if you can, but I think that would be, in some ways, I think, counter to the kind of attempts to reconfigure memory that we have seen, where it's more likely that there is going to be an attempt to absent someone rather than to add.
Yes, and going back, I don't know if you want to add something, maybe because you have Jennifer, Gwendolyn. No, yeah. So I was also thinking about, we had some comments, thinking about erasure. We had some comments from our audience, and one from a curator, Fess Davis Ruffins, was talking about how some other works in the collection of the Smithsonian has a long history of erasure, and I was wondering if you could talk about this history of erasure, maybe in a larger terms, and how maybe not only families or like family portraits, but also institutions are going back to that history of erasure. Yes, and also thinking about, you know, in our moment, as you were talking a lot about our current moment, and seeing a lot of cultural institutions, universities making public an acknowledgement of their ties to the institution of slavery and erasure. So I was thinking about this moment also generally, about this work, if you have any thoughts about how that impact also your work and the way you address painting.
Jen, do you want to talk about the migration of objects from north to south and southern collection?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, go back in the slides.
Yeah, I go back. Are you thinking of the Anthony or the Yeah. Yeah. I mean, both of these really. I don't know. It's really interesting. Do Anthony, but I feel like one of the things that really emerges for me is as I think about Emily's and company's exhibition, is really just the intertwining of absence and presence, and just the ways that, you know, to think about erasure, absolutely erasure is happening, but it's happening in order to make something else present, right? And so I think thinking about that process as always being tied together is really helpful. I was just thinking about recovery, that I think it's amazing that we are still in a moment where we are finding images of Black ancestors that are coming into museum collections, and in really complicated institutional histories and private family histories. So both of these two images, this one on loan to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, and this one that entered the Mississippi Museum of Art's collection in 2017, images of enslaved women, Delia, whose surname we don't know, and Violet Anthony, who, you know, the members of the white family had these images commissioned, kept them, and they descended along those family lines before coming into museum spaces recently. And so I think with the Anthony case, this is really fascinating, because the white family's sort of story about this portrait was that they knew they had white ancestors who had been in Charleston. They assumed that this painting then had come from Charleston. And so the research that was done to situate Violet Anthony as an enslaved woman in Pennsylvania is really important, right? That along with the themes of Emily's exhibition, that, enslavement is happening across multiple areas, not just in the South. And I think to me that also points to the power of museums. This is tricky. These are hard images to look at. These are complicated histories. But the space of the museum, I think, is a space where those can be asked and thought critically about in ways that, these images in the hands of white families, no matter how well-meaning, those constrict the narratives that these paintings can tell. Whereas in a museum space, I think we can appreciate Black agency. So I feel like this is kind of in some ways a really exciting moment for historic artworks that are being discovered, like Balazar, like these two images that are carrying their own complex histories of absence and presence, but are doing so in ways that are now visible in museums. Yeah.
And also we can see in the reception of Unnamed Figures that there is eager from the audience, from the public, to learn more about these histories of erasure, and also being willing to learn and excited to learn more about this. And so I think there's definitely also a need in the public area. And I was wondering if you could talk also about, for you, how to see these moments happening, and if there's any changes from when you talked a lot about that also today during the talk, but if there's anything that you feel like has changed and really made your work easier, or made inform the way you've been working the last 5 years. And
I would certainly say with Moses Williams, I revisited my work on Moses yet again. I had gone back into it for the Blackout exhibition catalog, but I started thinking about it again in preparing my original essay for republication in a book that comes out in about a month and a half from Duke University Press, called Art of Remembering. It's pretty cool. Very happy about that. But so in revisiting this silhouette, I went to the library company's website, and whereas my initial engagement with this was sitting in the reading room with this box, like paper boxes of silhouettes that were uncatalogued, since then, these images that are in the James Rush silhouette collection have been digitized, and they're available now on the library company's website. And they're not cataloged in a lot of detail, though. It's sort of like a big photo dump, like you would put on Instagram or something after a vacation. There are like 300 or 400 pictures of silhouettes, and you just kind of scroll through them. And as I was scrolling through them, one of the things that I noticed, particularly towards the end of that scroll, that there were multiple images of profiles of people that I believed were African descended, based on their nose, their lips, their hair, the ways that they were shown. But there's really no way to say that that for sure, or to say that those who I might visually read as being solely European descended are that, right? And I was thinking about the, again, David Brigham's work in this area, and how when David was looking at these silhouettes, he said, well, we know that there was at least one other Black sitter for a silhouette in the Peel Museum, and that was Mr. Shaw's Black Man, because it's written across the bottom, just as Moses Williams, just as the name is written across the bottom of this one. But I think that these digitizing of collections make this kind of research, which I was doing during the pandemic from home, not able to go to the library company, will continue to yield new questions, new objects. We just have to kind of have patience. We still have to dig, I know where the cursor is, like on the search bar underneath that collection, like number 585, I think is, Black sitter. But I don't know, for sure, right? Because it's just a matter of speculation. But I believe that as collections become more and more accessible, those of us who are, just going to sit there and nerd out and, and look at each one of them, will find more things that will expand conversation. So, just in finding these 3 or 4 silhouettes, I tripled in my mind the number of Black people who went to Peale's Museum, which changes, our understanding of the museum.
Yes, completely. But thank you so much to you both. I think we have one more question. We have 5 minutes. Someone, Beverly, is asking what criteria is currently used when considering relabeling. So if you have any more thoughts about the process of relabelization and maybe Emily, you would like to share more about this work you did for Unnamed Figures?
Yeah, I think this is that's a really good question to bring up, because Jen and Virginia's article is such an important contribution to the field in terms of making some of these curatorial decisions more transparent. It's also, though, every case is different, right? And so we had to decide, in the case of the, over 100 works in the show, how we were going to address this. With the BMA, we had a great roadmap and we knew exactly what to do. But with other works, and even works in our own collection, it's like, well, how do we deal with titles when we know that these works probably, certainly in the case of 18th century works of art, weren't even given titles at the time of their making. So any title is a past kind of layering onto something. And we were borrowing works of art from other institutions too. So there was a question of, well, we can't, or it doesn't seem appropriate for us to be intervening with other institutional decisions, although some institutions, I think, have spent more time, have had the opportunity at this point to spend more time thinking about this than others. So we ultimately decided that, as Jen and Virginia point out so fluently in their article, it's also important to keep the history of erasure that is present in some of these older titles. So we ultimately decided we would retain the titles provided to us by each institution and include explanatory language about the, non-neutrality of these captions. We also, we made some small interventions that we hope were fruitful by reorienting the organization of information, where usually you have the title at the top and then you have the label copy, but we flipped it so that to subtly, hopefully, guide folks to actually say, oh, perhaps this cataloging information isn't the most important thing to look at first. And then, by taking in the interpretation first, you are focusing more on the Black figures that the interpretation is bringing forth. So that was how we thought about this for Unnamed Figures. It's not an easy set of decisions to make, and there are a lot of obstacles that are logistical or bureaucratic, and I think we can't discount that those elements are all part of the process, and that in some ways historical museum structures can put up barriers, even just the simple, well, we've always done it this way. Okay, maybe it's time to rethink that. And I'm continually grateful to everyone at AFAM for, really saying, oh, that's a great idea, let's try it, rather than really that those aren't the guidelines and we have to, stick with the standards. And so that was actually really exciting to be able to make some of those interventions.